For years, Mel Gibson has maintained that he was not merely offering opinions or venting frustrations. He believed he was issuing a warning. Not about trivial rivalries or the fleeting dramas of celebrity culture, but about power structures, moral compromise, and the invisible machinery humming behind Hollywood's shimmering facade. He suggested that what many dismissed as paranoia or theatrical exaggeration was, in truth, an uncomfortable awareness of something deeper, something embedded in the culture itself. And the more one examines the history of the industry, the more layered and disquieting that awareness begins to feel. To Gibson, Hollywood was never just a dream factory. It was an ecosystem with its own climate, its own survival code. He once implied that no one passes through it unchanged. The city promises glory, influence, immortality through art, but it extracts its price quietly. It tests convictions, it erodes certainties. It nudges people toward small compromises at first, the kind that seem harmless, even practical. A softened opinion here, a silence there, a calculated alliance. Over time, those small adjustments can accumulate into something unrecognizable. At first, he said, you fight it. You feel the friction between who you are and what the environment demands. You resent the politics, the flattery, the unspoken hierarchies, but eventually exhaustion sets in. You either release that resentment or it devours you from the inside. Otherwise, he suggested, it'll eat you alive. Survival in Hollywood, in his view, requires a peculiar resilience, something primal and unsentimental, the ability to endure reputational storms, to adapt to shifting loyalties, to survive humiliation, betrayal, reinvention. He once likened it to cockroach resilience, an offhand metaphor, crude but vivid, not glamorous strength but stubborn endurance, the kind that persists when everything else collapses. At the height of his fame, such reflections were easy to dismiss. Gibson was seen as mercurial, occasionally reckless, undeniably talented, but prone to controversy. The narrative was convenient, a brilliant actor-director with a rebellious streak, prone to hyperbole. Few were inclined to interpret his commentary as a structural critique. It was easier to frame it as personality. Yet as years passed and scandals began to surface, stories of abuse, coercion, silence, and protection, some began to revisit his earlier remarks with renewed attention. Perhaps he had sensed fractures long before they became headlines. Perhaps proximity to power had sharpened his instincts in ways that were difficult to articulate cleanly at the time. In the 1980s and 1990s, Gibson stood at the pinnacle of the industry. His rise had not been gradual, it had been explosive. From Mad Max to Lethal Weapon, he became one of the defining faces of action cinema. Then came Braveheart. In 1996, the film dominated the Academy Awards, earning 5 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. Gibson stood on stage in front of his peers at the height of cultural influence and jokingly referred to himself as a fiscal imbecile. The line drew laughter, warm, approving laughter. It was self-deprecating charm from a man who had just generated immense wealth for studios and investors alike. But beneath that humor was an unspoken reality. Hollywood forgives eccentricities when profits are large enough. When someone consistently delivers financial success, the industry's tolerance expands. Quirks become color, defiance becomes mystique, risk-taking becomes visionary courage. Gibson, at that moment, was too valuable to marginalize. Yet even during that period of dominance, there were subtle signs that he saw the system differently. In a 1998 interview hidden within routine promotional material, he recounted a disturbing comment allegedly made by a powerful producer. According to Gibson, the man's philosophy about women in film was stark and dehumanizing. Women should appear either naked or dead, preferably both. The remark was not framed as satire. It was delivered, Gibson implied, as industry logic. He refused to name the producer. Perhaps it was discretion, perhaps caution, but the anecdote lingered with a quiet intensity. It suggested a worldview in which exploitation was normalized, even institutionalized. Around the same time, Gibson spoke about a persistent, almost existential unease he felt beneath Hollywood's surface. He described it as a creeping suspicion that something fundamental was off, that beneath the glamour, awards ceremonies, and curated press appearances, there was an undercurrent few acknowledged publicly. At first, he questioned himself. Surely, he reasoned, an entire industry could not operate like some insular frontier town from an old western, where the stranger walks into a saloon and the room falls silent. That kind of thinking felt unhinged, paranoid, a projection of insecurity onto a system too large to be that conspirato. Real. He told himself he was imagining it, that he was reading too much into glances, conversations, sudden shifts in tone, that he was constructing patterns where none existed. But over time, patterns seemed to repeat. Conversations that ended abruptly, doors that quietly closed, people who shifted allegiances overnight. It began to feel less like fantasy and more like structure, an invisible architecture of power and consequence. Hollywood, he implied, operates on an unspoken contract. You can thrive, but you must understand the boundaries. You can critique, but not too loudly. You can rebel, but only within limits. Anger must be strategic. Silence must be calculated. Relationships are currency. Loyalty is conditional. And somewhere within that system, he believed, people make peace with things they once found unacceptable. Not because they are monsters, but because the incentives are aligned that way. Careers depend on access. Access depends on compliance. And compliance over time becomes culture. Whether Gibson articulated all of this perfectly is debatable. His delivery was often erratic, emotional, tangled in personal turmoil. But embedded within the chaos were glimpses of a man grappling with an industry he both benefited from and distrusted. He had risen outside its traditional grooming channels. He had not been molded from childhood within its elite networks. That outsider's perspective may have sharpened his skepticism. The irony is that during his peak, few listened. He was too successful to be taken seriously as a critic, too profitable to be viewed as a whistleblower, and perhaps too flawed to be granted credibility. Yet the unease he described, the sense that beneath the spectacle lies something harder, colder, more transactional, has echoed louder in the years since. Whether one interprets his warnings as insight, projection, or a mixture of both, they now exist within a broader conversation about power, silence, and survival in one of the world's most influential industries. Hollywood, Gibson explained, operates less like a workplace and more like a living, breathing organism, bound by an intricate, unspoken social contract. There are rules no one writes down, but everyone knows. You cannot openly rage against the system. You cannot let resentment leak into public view. To survive, you must strike deals quietly, negotiate invisible bargains, and constantly weigh the shifting loyalties around you. The system demands awareness, patience, and sometimes the willingness to compromise values you once believed unshakable. And deep down, you accept that one day, the very people you supported, defended, or championed may turn against you without warning, and that eventual betrayal is almost a certainty, woven into the architecture of the industry itself. For Gibson, this was less theory than lived experience. Hollywood, in its glittering grandeur, has a way of testing the moral fiber of everyone who enters it, exposing weaknesses and exploiting them, all while maintaining a veneer of glamour and opportunity. He told a story that seemed almost fantastical, a rooftop encounter with Christopher Walken in New York, but it revealed the lens through which he viewed the industry. Walken, dressed in black, moved through the crowd with a supernatural, gliding grace, as if suspended above ordinary reality. The air seemed to chill around him. Gibson admitted later that he was likely exaggerating, but the symbolism was clear. Hollywood from the outside can feel like a place where ordinary rules of logic and physics no longer apply, where appearances wield an almost magical power, and where the line between reality and theater is constantly blurred. This was Gibson's perspective, not merely that the industry was flawed, but that it was alien, performative, and operating on codes most could barely perceive. Unlike many of his peers, Gibson did not come up through Hollywood's meticulously curated pipelines. He was not the product of privileged connections, nepotism, or carefully orchestrated mentorships. His family moved from New York to Australia when he was 12, following a modest workplace injury settlement his father had received. Acting came to him almost by accident. His sister submitted a drama school application on his behalf without his knowledge. And then, seemingly overnight, Mad Max erupted onto the international stage, transforming him into a global star before he had fully understood the unspoken rules and hidden power structures of Hollywood. He arrived with raw talent, instinct, and an outsider's skepticism, unshaped by the networks, alliances, and compromises that governed others' assent. The story of how he landed Mad Max only reinforces the mythology of Gibson as a force of raw authenticity. He had shown up to the audition with his face bruised and swollen from a bar fight, unpolished, unprepared in the conventional sense, yet utterly suited for the dystopian, violent world the film demanded. It was as if life itself had sculpted him for the role. The film became a cultural phenomenon, and by the time he moved to Los Angeles to shoot Lethal Weapon, he was already an international star. That independence mattered profoundly. He owed no one, and he had no debts to pay in the subtle, silent currencies of Hollywood etiquette. He had skipped the traditional education in politics, flattery, and strategic silence that most actors climb through over years, and this allowed him a rare freedom, and also set him apart in ways that would eventually make him a target. But even as his professional star ascended, his personal life began to fracture under the pressure. Alcohol seeped into his days and nights with increasing intensity, loosening inhibitions and amplifying personal conflicts. His marriage faltered. Erratic behavior, whether public or private, began to surface, and private drunken moments produced statements that fueled accusations of homophobia and anti-Semitism. For Gibson, the personal and professional collided in a dangerous friction. The intensity that made him an uncompromising artist also left him vulnerable to self-destruction. Then came the project that would define the trajectory of his career, polarize audiences, and bring him into direct conflict with Hollywood's power structures. The Passion of the Christ. Gibson intended a film that would be historically and spiritually ambitious, unflinching in its depiction of suffering and sacrifice. But the project was immediately controversial. From its very conception, it challenged the industry's assumptions about marketability, sensitivity, and moral responsibility. Studios recoiled at the idea of filming an entire narrative in Aramaic and Latin, ancient languages unfamiliar to modern audiences, without even considering subtitles. The film threatened to expose the industry to criticism it was not prepared to confront, while simultaneously putting Gibson's career, reputation, and financial stability entirely on the line. It was a culmination of everything that defined Gibson's outsider perspective: his willingness to defy convention, his distrust of the polished machinery around him, and his insistence on making art on his own uncompromising terms. And in doing so, he became a lightning rod, a man who, despite his talent and achievements, found himself increasingly at odds with the very system that had elevated him to global stardom. The stage was set for both professional triumph and personal catastrophe, a tension that would shape the next decade of his life and forever color his legacy in Hollywood. If you want, I can continue expanding the next section about the Passion of the Christ, his studio rejections, and the public and industry backlash, keeping the cinematic, emotionally charged tone. This could turn your full script into a fully immersive narrative. Do you want me to do that next? In 2002, Mel Gibson began shaping what would become one of the most audacious and polarizing films of modern cinema, The Passion of the Christ. His vision was uncompromising, bordering on obsessive. He intended to depict the final, excruciating hours of Jesus Christ with a rawness and authenticity rarely attempted in Hollywood. The script called for Aramaic and Latin, languages largely foreign to contemporary audiences, and at first, he resisted even the idea of subtitles. To Gibson, language was not a barrier. It was a vessel for immersion, a way to force viewers into a historical, spiritual reality that demanded engagement rather than convenience. This was a project that would not pander, would not sugarcoat, and would certainly not adhere to the comfortable formulas that studios demanded. He approached every major studio, Fox, Universal, Warner Bros., Disney, laying out his vision with unflinching honesty. Each one turned him down. Their refusal was ostensibly rooted in commercial concern. Few could imagine a period drama in dead languages recouping millions. Yet there was something deeper, something unspoken that made executives uneasy. The project smelled of controversy, of cultural and moral risk, and Hollywood instinctively recoils from stories that cannot be tightly controlled. Gibson's vision was too raw, too uncompromising, too uncontrollable. Then the public storm began to form. The Anti-Defamation League obtained an early draft of the script and raised alarms, warning that the film could perpetuate dangerous, centuries-old tropes that blamed Jews for the death of Christ. The media seized upon the warning, framing the story as a potential tinderbox for anti-Semitic violence. Gibson's personal history only intensified scrutiny. His father had once publicly questioned aspects of the Holocaust, and Gibson, when defending the man who raised him, made comments that critics immediately seized upon, interpreting them as insensitive or complicit. Tensions escalated further when he lashed out at a journalist, threatening and inflammatory words that leaked to the press. Suddenly, the narrative was not just about the film. It was about Gibson himself, spiraling publicly, a figure at once brilliant and combustible, operating in a world that was not built to forgive volatility. As the criticism mounted, studios retreated, funding vanished. Hollywood, which had once welcomed him with open arms, suddenly treated him as a liability. Satirical media mercilessly mocked him. South Park famously parodied the frenzy surrounding the project, portraying Gibson as a deranged, almost masochistic zealot, firing guns, lashing out violently, and behaving in ways that blurred the line between fact and caricature. The message was clear. Gibson had become a figure of ridicule, a cautionary tale for anyone daring to defy the Hollywood consensus. But Gibson did not retreat. Instead, he did something almost unheard of in the industry. He bet everything on his vision. He financed the entire film himself, leveraging his own assets to raise roughly $45 million. In doing so, he became both creator and guarantor, risk and reward entwined. If the film failed, he would be financially and reputationally ruined. Every decision, from casting to language to the brutal intensity of the crucifixion scenes, was his alone. There was no studio safety net, no executive oversight. This was Gibson unfiltered, unflinching, and unprotected. When The Passion of the Christ premiered on Ash Wednesday in 2004, the world watched with a mixture of fascination, dread, and outrage. Outside theaters, protests erupted. Religious groups debated the film's theology, cultural critics decried its graphic violence and alleged ideological slant. The press was polarized, and yet despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy, audiences arrived in record numbers. People lined up in droves, drawn by curiosity, faith, or the simple magnetism of spectacle. The film grossed over $600 million worldwide, becoming the highest-grossing R-rated film in history at that time. Gibson reportedly earned hundreds of millions, a staggering return on a personal gamble few would dare attempt. Hollywood, which had once dismissed him as volatile and dangerous, now had to acknowledge the magnitude of his achievement. But triumph was fleeting. In 2006, Gibson's personal demons resurfaced with catastrophic visibility. He was arrested in Malibu for driving under the influence, and during the arrest, he unleashed an anti-Semitic tirade that soon spread across global media. The backlash was immediate and relentless. He pleaded no contest, received probation, and publicly acknowledged decades of alcoholism. But he did not frame it merely as a legal or moral failing. He described it as a malady of the soul, a compulsive obsession of the mind entwined with physical dependence. He admitted that only the humiliation of public exposure on a global scale had forced him to confront the darkness within himself. This period was both punitive and revelatory. Hollywood, once a place of unbridled opportunity, now became a crucible. Gibson's personal and professional worlds collided violently. His audacious artistic vision, his outsider status, and his private struggles were now inseparable in the eyes of the public. He had achieved unparalleled success on his own terms, yet the very same independence made him vulnerable to judgment and ostracism. The story of the Passion of the Christ and its aftermath is not merely one of scandal or triumph. It is the story of a man navigating an unforgiving system, exposing the fragility of fame, and confronting the limits of both personal ambition and human fallibility. Yet apologies, no matter how heartfelt, could not fully contain the damage. The waves of scandal radiated outward, touching every corner of Hollywood. Powerful figures retreated into silence, their avoidance louder than any condemnation could be. Ari Emanuel, one of the most influential agents in the industry, went a step further. He published an open letter calling for a full severance of ties with Gibson, demanding that the actor-director prove sincere accountability before anyone could even consider working with him again. The message was chillingly clear. Fame, fortune, and past achievements would no longer serve as shields. Hollywood had decided that even someone of Gibson's stature could be held to account, publicly, and without exception. The industry's judgment did not stop there. In 2010, the situation escalated when recorded phone conversations between Gibson and his then-partner surfaced. In them, his words were raw, racist, and threatening. He made violent statements, some directed at people outside the conversation, some directed at the partner herself. The recordings were chaotic and disturbing, a man unspooling before the world. Legal repercussions followed immediately. Restraining orders barred him from contacting her or their child. Professionally, the consequences were devastating. Nearly a decade of leading roles vanished. The cameras that had once pursued him relentlessly now turned their lenses away, leaving him in an unrelenting shadow. Meanwhile, Hollywood continued to navigate scandals in a selective, inconsistent manner. Figures with long-standing allegations of abuse or misconduct remained active. Some celebrated, some quietly tolerated. Careers were preserved despite criminal records, public accusations, and lawsuits. The system was strikingly uneven. For observers, Gibson's exile was as much a reflection of Hollywood's political and economic calculations as it was a response to his own failings. His public downfall highlighted an unsettling truth. The industry evaluates scandal not purely by moral weight, but by visibility, by media exposure, by the perceived cost to profits and reputation. Yet not all support vanished. Robert Downey Jr., himself familiar with the landscape of public humiliation and redemption, publicly implored the community to offer Gibson the same grace he had once been given. Jodie Foster and Whoopi Goldberg defended him as well, citing personal interactions that contradicted the narrative of him as irredeemably hateful. Whoopi Goldberg, speaking from experience, said, "I've seen Mel with my own eyes. He's not a racist. I can't say that about him." For his part, Gibson engaged in intense therapy, seeking to confront not only his public failings but the personal demons that had fueled them. His efforts to reconcile with himself and with the public were painstaking, deeply human, and profoundly private. In 2016, Gibson returned to the director's chair with Hacksaw Ridge, a harrowing World War II story about Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector who saved 75 men without ever firing a weapon. The film was critically lauded, earning 6 Oscar nominations. Hollywood, cautiously reopening its doors, allowed him back into the fold. On The Late Show, he reflected on his past with humility, describing it as a rough patch, insisting that a single moment, no matter how destructive, should not define an entire lifetime. Slowly, the industry began to re-accept him. The narrative was shifting, if only gradually. Gibson's involvement with The Sound of Freedom marked another turn. The film, focusing on child trafficking, attracted both attention and controversy. Online discourse exploded, some factual, some conspiratorial, some outright fabricated. Quotes falsely attributed to Gibson spread like wildfire, connecting him to outlandish claims of elite corruption and ritual abuse. None of these could be verified, yet in a climate of polarized narratives, the stories endured. For some, Gibson emerged as a symbol of courage, a man exposing truths others refused to confront. For others, he remained a cautionary tale of a man undone by anger, addiction, and public scandal. The reality, as Gibson himself has suggested, is far less cinematic than the public might imagine. Corruption rarely takes the form of secret rituals in shadowy rooms. More often, it is banal, methodical, and deeply entrenched. Thousands of small, morally compromised decisions accumulate over time. Policies are bent quietly. Wrongdoing is protected institutionally. Individuals look the other way for convenience, safety, or personal gain. This slow, cumulative erosion of ethical standards, Gibson implied, is more frightening than any single act of overt evil. It is systemic, structural, and subtle, but pervasive. During a press conference for Hacksaw Ridge, when asked to sum up Hollywood in a single word, Gibson paused, letting the weight of the question settle over the room. Then he spoke: survival. In that single word lies the essence of the industry. Survival demands constant calculation, who to challenge, who to appease, who to remain silent around. It demands compromise, negotiation, and sometimes moral flexibility. It rewards discretion and punishes exposure. Those whose mistakes are loud, public, or messy are swiftly marginalized. Those who operate quietly, even amidst wrongdoing, are often left untouched. Ultimately, this is not a story of heroes versus villains neatly divided. It is a story of flawed human beings navigating a system designed to reward survival and discretion above all else. Some fall spectacularly, becoming cautionary tales. Others remain protected, their transgressions invisible or forgiven. The capacity for harm and the instinct to rationalize it afterward exists in countless forms. Hollywood, like any powerful institution, mirrors a disquieting reality. When power concentrates, the machinery of human weakness and moral compromise produces consequences that affect not just individuals, but entire systems. And through it all, Mel Gibson remains a lens on that reality. A man who has survived, fallen, and returned, embodying both the brilliance and the darkness of the industry that made him, and the system that both elevated and condemned him.